today's step-by-step walkthrough, I will be using SPSS version 30 to perform, interpret, and write up a bivariate correlation. I recommend downloading today's dataset before we begin. You can also access this resource in the Psychology Resource Library. Here we have our dataset within SPSS. Our first variable here, ID, represents our participants, and we can see that each row corresponds to a single participant within our dataset. If we toggle over to variable view, we can see the type of data that we have. We have age and gender. These are demographic variables that we won't be considering within our analyses today. And then these remaining 4 variables are the ones that we're interested in today. Here we have scores on the Hong Trait Psychological Reactance Scale. So this concept refers to a disdain for rules, regulations, or other impositions that are thought to threaten or eliminate behavioral freedoms. And higher scores on this variable indicate greater psychological reactance. The remaining 3 variables that we have here are from the General Attitude to Institutional Authority scale. They represent scores on 3 subscales, which assess support for police, law, or military, respectively. And higher scores on each of these subscales represents greater support or more positive attitudes towards each of these institutions. Then to run our analysis, we go to Analyze, Correlate, Bivariate. We can then simultaneously move our 4 variables of interest into the variables box by using the Shift key. We want to ensure that Pearson is selected under correlation coefficients, and we can leave the default setting at two-tailed under test of significance. We also want to ensure that flag significant correlations has been selected. If we click Options, you can see that there are 2 ways to deal with missing data. Excluding cases listwise removes participants from all comparisons if they have missing data, whereas excluding cases pairwise only removes participants from the specific comparison that there is missing data. Therefore, excluding cases listwise means that you will have a consistent n or sample size value across all of your comparisons, whereas excluding cases pairwise might mean that you have a different n or sample size value between your comparisons. Because in this dataset we don't have any missing data, we'll get the same results regardless of which approach we take. Continue. Then we'll go on to confidence interval. Here we want to ensure estimate confidence interval of bivariate correlation parameters is selected and that the confidence interval percentage is at 95. Press continue. Then instead of pressing OK and automatically giving us our output, we'll press paste. This opens our syntax window, and this is good practice as you can then save your syntax and run your analysis at a later date without having to move through the steps that we just did. Highlight your syntax and press the run button, and here we have our output. If you look at this correlations table, you might notice that the information is mirrored across this diagonal line of 1s. In other words, you only need to consider what is in this top right triangle or this bottom left-hand corner triangle to get all the results that you need. If we just isolate a single comparison, we could look at the relationship between the Hong psychological reactance scores and support for police. You'll notice that we have both a sign and a numerical value, and we consider these separately when interpreting our correlation. The way we would interpret this negative sign is that as psychological reactance scores increase, support for police decreases. Alternatively, as support for police increases, psychological reactance decreases. When we then look at that numerical value, we're assessing the strength or magnitude of the relationship between those 2 variables. Using Cohen's conventions, we could consider this a moderate or a medium effect size. We can also see that it is a significant relationship looking at the 2 asterisks. Here, correlation is significant at the 0.01 level, and we can also see our significance value here below. To calculate our coefficient of determination, we take our Pearson correlation value for that specific comparison. We then multiply it by itself and then multiply it by 100 in order to obtain a percentage. In other words, there is 7.9% shared variance between psychological reactance and support for police. And this is just another way of thinking about the sides of the relationship between these two variables. If we look at our 95% confidence intervals, what this tells us is that we can be 95% confident that the true population correlation coefficient for the relationship between these two variables sits between negative 0.426 and negative 0.121. The write-up for this correlation could be written as follows. There was a statistically significant, moderate negative bivariate correlation between psychological reactance and attitudes towards the police. If we then think about the values that we want to incorporate into the write-up, we want to include in the brackets there our degrees of freedom, which is our sample size minus 2. We also want to include our Pearson correlation value, our significance value, and then both our upper and lower confidence interval values. You can access the full suite of resources in the Psychology Resource Library. Follow our YouTube channel for more walkthrough videos like this one.